and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we dive into today's interview, I just wanted to mention that our editor's discussion episode will be off this Friday for the 4th of July. We'll be back to our regular programming schedule next week. It was a Wednesday night massacre, as one former U.S. official told CNN, when an appointee of President Donald Trump fired the heads of multiple government-funded media outlets. Conservative documentary filmmaker Michael Pack took over last month as the head of the U.S. Agency for Global Media after a 2-year confirmation process in the Senate. And one of his first actions after taking office was to sweep out the directors and advisory boards of Radio Free Europe / Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, and the Open Technology Fund. The two heads of the USAGM's flagship network, Voice of America, had resigned. All of this has raised questions about whether the news outlets that are under the USAGM, which have a long tradition of editorial independence, might become a political messaging arm of the Trump administration. Joining me now to discuss this is David Ensor, Director of the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. He served as Director of Voice of America from 2011 until 2015. David, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you very much.
So first, let's talk about what the U.S. Agency for Global Media is and what it isn't. Trump himself has called Voice of America a, quote, disgrace, and his administration said in a statement in April that the network, quote, too often speaks for America's adversaries, not its citizens. To help our listeners understand the validity of these complaints, I was hoping you could briefly tell us the history of VOA and the other outlets that receive funding from the USAGM, what their aims are, how independent they are.
With pleasure. But let me just first say those complaints have no validity whatsoever, in my opinion. Voice of America, which was the first of these organizations to be founded, started back in 1942, in the middle of World War II. The first language was German. It was set up using a loaned BBC transmitter. And it was designed to report news of the war, basically. The first words in German were, the news may be good, the news may be bad, but we will tell you the truth. And for the first year, at least, of the VOA's existence, it was reporting German victories, not good news from the point of view of most of the listeners. But then the victories started to come. And what VOA was trying to do was build a reputation for being accurate and honest and not being a propaganda organization. So that was the concept in World War II. Then along came the Cold War, and very quickly, Voice of America and the soon-to-be founded Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty became, you pointed very heavily at the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and trying to respond to communist propaganda in various ways. But again, mainly it was trying to respond to it by putting out factual news broadcasts. There has always been a kind of a debate and a struggle sometimes internally over whether there should be more of a propaganda, pro-American flavor to VOA or whether it should be strictly down the middle. That debate continues, but fundamentally, VOA is about news broadcasting. And in fact, back in 1976, Congress passed as law something called the VOA Charter, which was signed by then President Ford. And it basically says that VOA has a mandate to try to be truthful and accurate and fair, to give a full and fair picture of the United States, and to provide a forum for discussion of U.S. policy, in particular foreign policy, and to represent various responsible views on that. So that's been the outlines of what VOA has been. Radio Free Europe, originally funded by the CIA, was a little bit more edgy and attitudinal, if you will, in its origins, but it also has evolved to being basically trying to be a truthful news organization. And that has been the power of these broadcasters. Now, over time, the broadcasters, which were originally all doing shortwave radio, I mean, nowadays, with the communication revolution that has happened for humankind, VOA, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting Network, and the Office of Cuban Broadcasting, they're on every platform known to man. If there's a new app created that's going to reach a lot of people in a particular country or language group, these outfits will get onto it pretty quickly.
And so now, in addition to the two outlets you mentioned, there's also the outlets that are under the Middle East broadcast networks, and there's also an outlet in Cuba, I believe. So all of these networks broadcast in places where there's little to no independent media. Is that right?
Yes, although Voice of America has a broader mandate to tell the world about America and to do news in a more general sense. So Voice of America is broadcasting very widely over much of Latin America, much of Africa, for example. And in some of these countries, there's news broadcasting, but it's not strong in some areas, or maybe it doesn't report much on the United States. We, for example, when I was director, started very much going to commercial broadcasters in Latin America and saying, you have a good broadcast here. We've listened to it. We think it's responsible. You don't seem to be covering the United States very thoroughly. Why is that? They'd say, well, we don't have the resources. We haven't got anybody based in Washington. And we would say, well, you know what? We have someone from your home country who works at VOA, but went to a journalism school in the United States. We'd be prepared to have him or her report on your air every day. We would be the editors and check the copy, if you will. You'd have to credit your partner organization, Voice of America, but otherwise they could report on whatever you like. So that model has increasingly become a big piece of how VOA reaches audiences around the world.
Now, Trump is not the first Republican elected official to take aim at the VOA. It's pretty much been a perennial target of Republicans in Congress. What's the cause of all this animosity?
There's a basic debate that's gone on since the formation, I think, over whether VOA should be predominantly a propaganda voice or a independent news voice. And the latter is the road that was decided in 1976 is the way VOA should go. But there still are people in Congress who would like to go more in the other direction. So that's why there's been debate. But I should say that many of the strongest supporters of Voice of America and of Radio Free Europe and the others in Congress have traditionally been Republicans. Republicans see the need for a Voice of America and for America to be telling its story to the world, perhaps even more clearly than some Democrats do.
There were some efforts from members of Congress to water down VOA's independence during your tenure as director, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, there were two issues. One was the sort of editorial independence question, and attempts to water that down failed while I was director. And the other was to change the way the place is organized, and that did succeed. So in the final days of the Obama administration, a bill was passed and became law. President Obama signed it, which changed the structure from what it had been, which was a 9-person board called the Broadcasting Board of Governors, where the president's party would have basically 5 seats and the opposition would have 4, to a system where the president appoints a CEO of U.S. Broadcasting, and that CEO is, very powerful. We now have that situation, and the new CEO has recently taken office, Michael Pack, as you mentioned, the Trump appointee who's just come into office. And because the deck chairs have changed a little bit, he's actually sitting in the office I used to sit in.
It must be an interesting feeling.
I recognize it in the pictures.
Can you tell us a little bit about what we know about Pack from his background?
Yes, I mean, I think that the jury's still out on what kind of a CEO Michael Pack is going to be, because he has stressed in his hearings and since then that he will absolutely honor the firewall, protecting the journalists of Voice of America and the other organizations from interference by the administration of the day, i.e. the Trump administration. He respects that. He understands that. He's going to enforce that, he says. On the other hand, immediately on taking office, he fired all the remaining entity heads that hadn't already resigned. Nobody's ever done that before, and that sent shockwaves through the broadcasting organizations. And there are people on the Hill and elsewhere who are afraid that Michael Pack wants to turn this whole USAGM United States Agency for Global Media, that's the umbrella agency he's the head of, turn it into a kind of a propaganda organization for the Trump administration.
One of the people he fired, the head of the Open Technology Fund, I believe was already scheduled to resign effective July 1st, and yet was fired anyway. That sends quite a message.
It did. And he also fired Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, the head of MBN, and Jamie Fly, the head of RVRL, both of whom, are Republican. So this was a cleaning house that wasn't just partisan. It was sort of anybody who isn't one of the Trump people must go.
Michael Pack has also been reported to have ties with the former Trump White House advisor, Steve Bannon. How extensive is that relationship?
Well, my understanding is that Steve Bannon actually worked for him rather than the other way around, advising him and working on a couple of documentaries. Michael Pack has made a number of documentaries, coming from a quite conservative Republican point of view on a number of issues. But his documentaries have run on, places like PBS, which wouldn't be seen as coming from that end. So, he's got a history of working in public broadcasting, but also he's seen as a thinker very much on the right.
Now, why did Pack's confirmation hearing take so long? 2 years is quite a long time to be going through that process.
Though the Senate is Republican controlled, the then Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee had a very good relationship with Michael Pack's predecessor, liked him and thought he was doing good things.
Are you referring to Bob Corker, the former senator from Tennessee?
Yes. Senator Corker had a good relationship with John Lansing, who was the appointed CEO prior to Michael Pack, and felt he was doing a good job. And then along comes this nomination of Michael Pack, and as the committee staff start to look into him, they find some areas where there are allegations of financial impropriety that they want to look into. And long story short, the committee kind of dragged its feet for a long time. And then the ranking minority member, Senator Menendez from New Jersey, a Democrat, took up that cudgel and said, when there was a proposal to have a vote, said, "Why are we having a vote on this guy? He hasn't been thoroughly vetted yet, and there are real questions about him." So, that's why there was delay, or that's at least what the senators said was the reason for the 2 years.
Now, has he given any indication about who he might appoint to replace all the people he fired as heads of these networks? That would seem to suggest a lot about the future direction of these outlets.
He has appointed a number of people who are basically Trump loyalists to board seats on the boards of these various entities. But he has not, at least as I speak to you at this moment, he has not yet named the heads of any of the entities that I'm aware of. Those announcements should be coming, I would think, any time now, and they will be very important. He has appointed a man named Andre Mendez as his COO, Chief of Operations, I guess is what you'd call that. And Andre is a person that I know who was there when I was there, very, very conservative, and a bit of an operator. Let me just say that.
I should mention for our listeners that we're recording this on Monday, so we could have some fresh news by the time this goes live on Wednesday about these appointees. But let's talk about this decision Pack made last week to make editorials a more prominent part of the VOA's programming. Is that something that could potentially be significant?
I mean, some people are very alarmed by that. It could be an alarming development because the audience, I mean, I'm just going to speak as, former VOA director. The audience that comes to Voice of America comes to it for information, not opinions, for the most part. I mean, I would say 95% of the audience. They're not coming to hear what somebody thinks or what the U.S. government thinks. They want to know what's going on. And they live perhaps in some cases in countries where there is no other way to find out. So putting editorials on, it runs the risk of confusing the audience if it's not properly labeled and done well. I will say, though, that part of the mission under the VOA Charter of 1976, part of the mission of Voice of America is to be a forum for the discussion of U.S. foreign policy and policy issues. So it would seem like it would be perfectly appropriate, and I used to try to work to have opinion be one of the things that Voice of America puts on its websites and on its programs. You just have to label it properly. And that has not always been done. And that is what concerns me, because you really don't want to confuse the audience. If there are going to be editorials advocating for the Trump administration's policy on X, Y, or Z, it needs to be crystal clear that that is the opinion of the administration. That is not journalism.
That gets into what I also wanted to ask you about, which is the role that VOA and the other outlets under USAGM play in U.S. public diplomacy overall, and sort of advocating for the United States in the international community, so to speak. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think it was Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard who first coined the phrase soft power and wrote several very interesting books developing that concept. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and the others are very much, if you will, soft power agencies for the United States. Now, the way Nye defines soft power, he says, well, it's broader than that. It's not about federal agencies. It's really about the inherent attractiveness of the United States. So it's more about things like Hollywood and Harvard, for that matter. Things that make our country attractive to others, to foreigners, and make them more likely to perhaps follow our lead or take our advice because they just find the place attractive, or our ideas are attractive. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, you might say, is part of our soft power.
Music, baseball,
yeah, rock and roll, jazz, you name it. These things make us attractive to foreigners. There are things that make us unattractive and weaken our soft power as well. But Voice of America, I would describe as something that amplifies, in a way, American soft power. But the reason it amplifies it is because it's First Amendment journalism. It's based around the concepts that are in the Constitution, that we should have free speech, that we should try to have media that tell the truth or have the goal of telling the truth. That's part of what makes us attractive to foreigners. That's part of why people want to listen to VOA. And if they listen to VOA being honest about America and its faults, they're more likely to believe VOA when it talks about the faults of their own societies from time to time.
So what happens then if VOA, and I realize that's a big if because, as you suggested, the jury is still out on whether Michael Pack will pursue this road, but what happens if VOA stops covering the faults of America and starts to only focus on trying to portray the good aspects?
People will smell a rat, in my view. People are going to pretty quickly figure out if the editorial policy has become one of only advocacy and only positive sides of the United States being presented. That will be pretty obvious pretty quickly, and the audience size will start to drop very fast. During the Cold War, Radio Moscow had the most powerful shortwave radio signal on the planet. It was clear as a bell, no matter where you went on this globe, and yet it had almost no audience. Why? Because it didn't tell you anything new. It was all, what does the Soviet Communist Party think about things, not what's going on. And really, people didn't need to listen for that. So they're looking for news they can use, information about what's going on. Am I in danger from, I don't know, Islamist terrorists or an attack from our neighbors in a country X or Y, or not? Facts. So I think that if Mr. Pack trims the sails in some way, subtly or otherwise, of the journalists, it will hurt the effectiveness of Voice of America and the others. I hope he doesn't do it.
Let's indulge a hypothetical for a moment and pretend that the critics are right and that he does proceed in that direction. And to add a little wrinkle to the hypothetical, let's also suggest that Joe Biden wins the presidential election in November and fires Michael Pack, as his campaign has said he would do if he wins. Would any damage that occurs from the politicization of Voice of America be instantly remediated as a result of that?
The problem is that Voice of America's enormous audience, estimated at 280 million or so a week, has been built on trust, on credibility. And it takes you many years to build trust and credibility, but it only takes a few bad stories to ruin it. And then reconstructing it is very difficult after that. The strength of VOA is built not only on the enormous advances in technological sort of communications that humanity has now, so many different ways of reaching people, but it's also built on human capital. There's a really dedicated group of people working at VOA. And I used to say that they work twice as hard as everyone else, it seems to me. Most of them, many of them, are immigrants to our country, coming from, in most cases, the place to which they now broadcast. So they might be Russian origin, or Ukrainian, or Persians, Iranians. They might be from Mali or Nigeria and speak perhaps Hausa, the language of northern Nigeria, and know that part of the world. And they've come to America because they want the American dream for themselves and their families. But they also care about the old country, and they're passionate about it, and they're passionate about the people left behind, and they want them to have truthful news broadcasting for themselves, so they can perhaps use it to better their lives. So these people will work almost any hours, and they're very dedicated. It's not about the money. It's a mission for them to do truthful journalism in their mother tongues. And there's a real esprit de corps there, which could be destroyed rather quickly, I would think, if the leadership were to start trying to turn it into a propaganda organization. I just hope they don't go that road. They've said they're not going to. Michael Packa said he's not going to. But some of the early moves cause concern, let's just say.
Throughout this interview, you've done a good job of laying out what VOA is and what it does. But there are a lot of misperceptions out there about what VOA is. How does that play into the personnel appointment process and the process of altering what VOA does?
Yeah, well, most Americans, if they've even heard of VOA, and many have not, but those who have, most of them tend to think that it is a Cold War agency, probably kind of long in the tooth and perhaps not really very important anymore. And they couldn't be more wrong. The audience has grown enormously over the last 5 or 10 years. It is one of the most effective ways that America reaches out to the rest of the world. In Iran, for example, where Voice of America broadcasts 6 hours a day in Farsi on television, satellite television, the dish that you need to receive that programming is illegal to own. And yet something like a third of the country has one. And about a quarter of the country, by the last statistics I saw, watches at least one VOA television show each week. So this is an enormous impact in a country that's the government of which is hostile to the United States, and the opinion of whose public is very important to us. So Voice of America is a lot more important than most Americans realize. And I think that has made it easier for politicians and bureaucrats to sort of turn it into a political football a little bit, because the public doesn't really see that this actually matters. But I can assure you it does.
David, thank you very much.
Most welcome.
David Ensor is Director of the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. He served as Director of Voice of America from 2011 until 2015. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.